welcome to this Chit Chat, who really needs no introduction, Natalie Wexler. Good afternoon to you, Natalie, beaming into us from Washington, DC. Thank you so much for taking some time out of your busy day to join me in what is our morning here in New Zealand.
Right. Well, thank you, Carla, for having me, and good morning to you.
It really is wonderful. As I was just mentioning to you before, the writing revolution is alive and well here in New Zealand, and it is a real privilege to have you joining me for this chit chat, just to share a little bit more in terms of your knowledge, pardon the pun, and some insights into some of the work that you've been doing in this space. So I'm just going to take a moment, Natalie, to introduce you to those people who are joining us for our chit chat this morning. Natalie Wexler is the author of Beyond the Science of Reading, Connecting Literacy Instruction to the Science of Learning and the Knowledge Gap, the Hidden Cause of America's Broken Education System and How to Fix It. She is the co-author with Judith Hochman of the first and second editions of The Writing Revolution. Natalie has a free Substack newsletter, Minding the Gap, and she was the host of season 1 of the Knowledge Matters podcast, Reading Comprehension Revisited. Natalie's articles and essays have appeared in the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Atlantic, the American Scholar, and other publications. She has spoken on education before a wide variety of groups and appeared on a number of TV and radio shows, including Morning Joe and NPR's On Point and 1A. Natalie holds a BA from Harvard University, an MA in History from the University of Sussex in the UK, and a JD from the University of Pennsylvania. Natalie has worked as a reporter, a Supreme Court law clerk, a lawyer, and a legal historian. Natalie lives in Washington, DC, and more information available about her and her incredible work is available on nataliewexler.com. My goodness me, what an incredibly busy lady.
Well, I didn't do it all at once, over a long period of time.
Yeah, amazing. You have a very interesting entrance into education, Natalie, from all of the work that you've been doing. So you obviously have an incredible passion for writing.
Yeah, I mean, I've always written in one capacity or another, and it's the way I figure things out in the world, and it can be a very powerful way of deepening knowledge.
Let's go into my first question, which is I'm hoping that you can share with us, based on the knowledge that you've acquired through your extensive experience and your partnerships with different people, what are the most common misconceptions about teaching writing that you encounter?
Well, I'd say, I mean, I'm speaking on the basis of, my experience in the United States, and I think the basic misconception is that we don't really need to teach it. There's an assumption has arisen in this country, at least, that kids will just pick it up if they read enough, if they write enough, they learn how to express themselves and develop a writerly voice and writing stamina, that the writing conventions and sort of the basics of, figuring out what a sentence is and how to organize a paragraph or an essay, that will just sort of come naturally. And that's a real, it's all well-intentioned, but it's a misinterpretation of the difficulty of writing. Writing, like reading, it's not a natural process. And writing is even harder than reading because it's expressive rather than receptive. So it's like the difference between understanding a foreign language, which, is a lot easier than speaking a foreign language. And so there has really not been much emphasis on explicitly teaching kids how to write, beginning at the sentence level. And what teachers have been doing, and they don't get good training in writing. It is definitely not anyone's fault. It's a systemic problem. But as my co-author Judith Hochman says, there's a lot of assigning writing, but no one is really learning how to teach writing.
My own experience, Natalie, as you're talking, is sort of flooding back into my head. And I think as a young teacher, once I had graduated from university and I came into the classroom, my own experience was that I did assign writing, and there was a lot of what did you do in the weekend writing. And I now know that I didn't have the knowledge to explicitly teach writing. I just, if I'm really honest, I just thought I did think writing was easy. And I did just think that writing was something that all children would be able to come to. And I didn't have a framework of specific skills that I needed to explicitly teach going into writing. And I certainly had no connection around whether or not children had anything to bring to the writing, or that connection with building knowledge, and that writing being a mechanism to take knowledge and help, embed it through into long-term memory. So I think there's many teachers like myself here in New Zealand and right across the world who haven't really understood or haven't been afforded the opportunity until such text as the Writing Revolution and other specific supports to build our own teacher knowledge of how we should be teaching writing, or how we could be teaching writing. Can you talk to us a little bit about acknowledging, as you did and I just have, around where teachers are? What would you say your ideal vision would be for how writing could be taught in our classrooms?
Well, I think ideally we would get rid of these artificial divisions between reading and writing, and both reading and writing and the content areas, because all of these things are connected. When it comes to reading, everything we're able to understand in written text draws on everything we've been able to learn. And reading, of course, is a way of learning. And similarly with writing, what we're able to produce in writing draws on everything we've been able to learn. And writing can be, as you've alluded to, a really powerful way of not learning about a new topic in the first instance, because you do need background knowledge in order to write. But once you have some background knowledge of the topic you're writing about, it is potentially an amazingly powerful way of really deepening and reinforcing that knowledge and making it stickier. But the problem is, as I mentioned, that writing is so cognitively overwhelming for inexperienced writers, and most students are going to be in that category, that they don't get those cognitive benefits from writing across the curriculum. So the trick is to modulate that heavy cognitive load that writing imposes, so that students can, first of all, get those benefits, and not just in English language arts or English class, but across the curriculum, and also learn to write well. And so that's why there are a number of ways to modulate that cognitive load. So I would love to see teachers begin instruction at the sentence level across the curriculum, because if writing is hard, writing at length only makes it harder. And having students engage in what cognitive scientists call deliberate practice. So, and that is not just doing something over and over again. It's breaking a complex skill into manageable chunks. The teacher needs to do that, or someone who knows what the whole process looks like. Give students practice with whatever chunk they need, and give them prompt, targeted feedback. And then when they've gotten that chunk of the process, move on to another chunk that they need. So with writing, you might start with sentences. That's the chunk that is not only going to modulate cognitive load, but it is also the foundation of all writing. If you can't put together a good sentence, you're unlikely to put together a good paragraph or a good essay. So in addition to that focus on sentence level instruction, which in the United States, there's been very little of, the other really important thing that I'd love to see happening across the curriculum is teaching students, or in most subjects anyway, teaching students how to create clear linear outlines for paragraphs and essays, because that again will modulate the heavy cognitive load that is imposed by having to write at length. And even if you're good at constructing sentences, writing at length imposes its own heavy cognitive load, because you're trying to juggle, in the limited capacity of working memory, what was I going to say next? Did I already
Mm.
say that? But if you have a clear outline to serve as a roadmap, then that modulates that burden and gives you more capacity to attend to the writing that you need to do. So
Mm.
ideally, that's the kind of approach I'd like to see.
Mm. I think that last point raises a really good point around us really sort of stopping in our tracks and considering that extensive writing is not going to be quality writing. And I'm going to go back and recap on sort of the four key takeaways from what you were just talking about, to flesh that out a little bit more. Firstly, you talked to us about the importance of building background knowledge and not just taking our students into a piece of writing with no or very limited background knowledge. Can I just ask, can we just sit there for a little bit longer? Because you talked about the findings in cognitive science and how the benefits of writing can really help in terms of long-term memory. Can we just talk a little bit about how teachers, in your experience, might go about doing that in terms of building background knowledge? When you've been working with your colleagues and talking with people, what are they doing to support students to build background knowledge more so?
Well, ideally, you'll have a curriculum or a framework at least that guides you through topics to cover, and is built in a logical sequence. And so if you've got a topic, let's say the topic is sea mammals, for example, if students know nothing about sea mammals, and especially if they're not yet proficient readers, the best way to build background knowledge of a new topic in the first instance is through a read aloud, the teacher reading aloud or an expert reader reading aloud, because that's going to modulate. If students are not yet proficient readers, you've got someone else shouldering the work of decoding the words, figuring out where to put the emphasis in the sentence and all of that. So we know that students' listening comprehension exceeds their reading comprehension on
Mm,
average through about age 13. So that's the way to introduce new information, but also along with that, having class discussion where students are using the vocabulary they've just heard in that read aloud.
mm,
They're talking about those concepts. That is a great way to transfer the new information to long-term memory.
mm,
So and you need to do this over a period of time. So spending not just one short book on sea mammals, but maybe a series of texts or one long book on sea mammals, because students really need to hear the same vocabulary, the same concepts repeatedly in somewhat different contexts over a period of time for those things to stick. But then once they have that knowledge built through really mostly oral means, so listening and discussion, we have evidence they are likely to be able to read and write about that topic at a
mm,
higher level. So you want to connect the reading and the writing to the listening and the speaking.
mm,
And certainly with reading, there's more research and more evidence about reading. Um, there are things like the baseball study, which people may have heard
mhm.
of. Kids who are poor readers but know a lot about baseball, if you give them a text describing a baseball game, they're going to probably be able to understand it pretty well. And similarly, it's even more important with writing to have knowledge of what you're writing about. It may be difficult to read about a topic you don't know much about, but
Mm,
writing about a topic you don't know much about is almost impossible. And it's a crushing load on working memory to try to absorb and understand new information and write about it essentially at the same time. So it
mm,
is a way of reinforcing knowledge rather than building new knowledge in the first instance. And it is really crucial I mean, in this country, we sometimes do have students write about personal experience of your, vacation you took, but sometimes there is a separate writing curriculum, and the students might get, let's say, two or three paragraphs about insects, and then their prompt is something like, "Now write about your favorite insect." But that's really not enough background
mm.
knowledge for them to
Yeah,
go
yeah.
on.
Mm. When you were talking, my head is going to what is called our secondary schooling years. So students that are 13 to 18. And I was really thinking about in those different subject level classes, the importance of teachers really understanding the significant link to building background knowledge, critical content that they want those students to know, and then opportunities to write about that. But which is what we already do, but it doesn't stop there, because what we now know is that where those students can't craft a good sentence, or they don't have, like you referred to, a clear linear outline for paragraphs, let alone an essay structure or any of those things, that we then are faced with having students who are 15, 16, 17, who may have some knowledge, may have little knowledge, don't know how sentences are constructed, actually don't know how to form a paragraph. So we're kind of in the same space that we potentially could be with our 7, 8, 9, 10-year-olds. And so I just want to then talk about a little bit more about the importance of sentence level instruction and the need for that sentence level instruction not stopping just in those very early years of schooling.
Absolutely. I mean, and we have the same situation in the United States where there are many high school students who don't understand the difference between a sentence and a sentence fragment, which is not, I mean, it's a fundamental understanding, but it's not simple, right? What is a complete thought? You can give them a definition of a sentence, subject, predicate, expresses a complete thought, but that does not at all guarantee that they'll be able to distinguish a complete sentence from a sentence fragment. So yes, and I think, we have many secondary teachers who think, well, working on sentences, that's for primary grades, but of course, if work has not been done, if students haven't learned that in earlier grades, it doesn't mean they somehow automatically acquire that knowledge just by getting older. And I think one thing to bear in mind is, yeah, you do need to teach students, and you can do this again through deliberate practice. Like if you have them distinguish between a series of phrases, which ones are the sentences and which ones are the sentence fragments, that gets into the sort of, they get a gut level sense of what makes a sentence a sentence. But at the same time, even that simple or fairly basic activity that about what makes a sentence can be a way of deepening and reinforcing knowledge, because one thing you can have them do is, if they've identified if this is embedded in content they're learning about in any subject, math, science, history, whatever, if you ask them to then turn the fragments into complete sentences by supplying information in their own words, that they have to retrieve that information, which they have to have it somewhere in long-term memory, but maybe they've slightly forgotten. So they're practicing retrieving that item of information. That's going to make it easier to retrieve in the future. And they are elaborating. So elaboration is another concept in cognitive science that has been found to really improve comprehension. And what it means is just sort of asking and answering questions about what you're learning and putting the answers in your own words. So that's what they're doing, even in that simple activity. And the same is true with, I think almost all of the activities described in the writing revolution. They really they combine these two very powerful principles from cognitive science: retrieval practice and elaboration. And it really boosts. So it is not, I mean, if you're a math teacher or science teacher, you might think, well, I don't want to take time away from my math instruction to teach writing. But I think once teachers try this, what they see is it's not taking time away from their content area instruction. It is actually making it more powerful, because it is really requiring students to grapple with these concepts.
100%. And to really, truly understand the critical content, right? So I think if we can help secondary teachers see that writing is a mechanism for committing critical content to long-term memory, then hopefully they will see, fundamentally see the value. I want to just sit with the Writing Revolution 2.0 for a moment. And one of the things myself that I love about the book is the systematic and cumulative nature. As an educator coming into there, I think you've done such a great job in actually building us up. You're building us up in terms of our teacher knowledge, and you're building up the sophistication of the concepts that we'll be teaching. Can I ask a really perhaps obvious question? Is that intentional?
Is it intentional to build up the teacher's knowledge of the?
Yes,
Yeah. Oh,
because
well,
because as I'm reading through, I really feel like you're building, and you're literally building my knowledge as I'm reading through it. And I have actually read the text and I have listened to the text for hours driving in my car as well. So
that's very interesting,
um,
because we're just discussing an audiobook version of the 2.0
yeah,
edition, and they hadn't even told us there was an audio version of the first edition.
right.
And I have volunteered to do the recording of the second edition, so we're just sort of working that out now. But Judy and I were both we were like, well, it's hard for us to understand how an educator would use this as an audiobook, because there are these visuals, there are these
Mm,
examples of worksheets and outlines and things like
mm,
that. But it's
mm.
interesting to hear you say, I mean, there is also, as I think, what you're talking about is there's a lot of explanation in the book
Yes.
that just is about like why does this work and why haven't other approaches work? And I'm very glad to hear that. I mean, I don't know that how intentional it was that we would be, sort of educating teachers in this way, but we do, of course, feel that it is important for teachers to not just to be told do this, but to understand why. Why does that
Yes.
make sense? And I guess that's, if we've accomplished that in the book, I'm very glad to hear it.
I think you've definitely accomplished that in the book. And myself, what it really brought to my attention is what I know and feel confident in teaching, and what I don't know and don't feel confident in teaching.
Mm.
And then I can be really responsive and be responsible for going and spending more times or a longer time in those areas that I'm not so confident in. And what's interesting about that, Natalie, is that's too where I've sort of in my mind ear tagged that particular area of the text, and then when I'm driving, I'll go back and I'll listen to that again.
Oh, ah,
I'll listen to that content again, and I'll think about what does that mean for practice,
hmm,
and then how my other teachers need further support in that space to
mhm,
be implementing that as well. So
hmm.
yeah, even though you didn't potentially know about the first
Yeah.
audiobook, I myself have found it really, really useful to extend my
Yeah.
knowledge and learning in that space.
And I do think it makes sense to have both the hard copy version and also listen to the audio as a way of reinforcing it, as you're doing. So
I
glad
wouldn't
to
be
hear it.
able I wouldn't be able to grasp the concepts just with the audiobook alone,
Right.
and also the mountain of resources that are in the text are just
Yeah.
so fantastic. And I find myself scribbling and making my own as I'm kind of looking beside, and
Mm.
which is a form of writing, isn't it? So I'm literally, in a way, using writing to secure my own learning.
Yeah.
Yeah, as I
Um,
go.
yeah. That's absolutely. I mean, one of the things in that's part of the method is teaching students how to take notes, which
Mm,
is which
mm,
is a form of writing. And it's again, we kind of assume, well, students will figure out how to do that, but many of them don't. They need to be told, here's how you abbreviate a word. This is a symbol you can use, and that
mm,
process of taking notes or annotating really helps kids understand and retain the information, because they're not just copying, they're
mm.
really having to process the information and distill it into note form.
Yeah. And I find that myself if I'm attending anything or I'm listening. So when I'd be interested to know your take on this. When students, particularly those that are in the older year levels, are, let's say, being, we're used to students taking notes in a secondary level, or that sort of 13 to 18. When teachers are reading aloud and they're taking that information in orally, do teachers ever go to a note-taking mechanism for students to extend on the oral piece?
Well, I mean, that's an interesting question, and I don't think we get into it in the Writing Revolution book, but there is some research from cognitive science showing that it can be cognitively overwhelming to take notes while you're listening. Um,
Right.
and I mean, it's very helpful to take notes, but if a teacher is talking, then the teacher might want to pause and say, well, I'm
Mm,
going to give you a few minutes now to take notes on what I've just said. Or
mm,
ideally, if they're still learning how to take notes, let's do this together. I mean, you want to do all of these activities initially, collectively and orally to modulate that cognitive load and give students practice before expecting them to do it independently. So I mean, and another thing about the writing revolution method that a point I'd like to make is it really needs, ideally should be woven into instruction. So
mm,
maybe you read a few paragraphs, and then might pause and say, well, now if we wanted to take some notes on this, like how would we do it? Or you might say, maybe we can
mm,
make quickly draft an outline of a paragraph on what we just heard. What would we say for a topic sentence? And then maybe some notes for the details. So
mm.
I think, there are ways to embed note taking into instruction, but I'd be careful about expecting, especially younger children, to take notes while they are
Mm,
listening. I think that's going to be too
mm,
much cognitively.
mm. And so much richer in terms of the possible active participation that would occur too, if it's compartmentalized, as you said, and the teacher stops, and then there is that time for discussion. So much richer in terms of what will come out of that. And I guess the teacher can be a lot more targeted too, to hinge on specific vocab that they want to pick up. Let's
Mhm.
explore this particular word in a little bit more detail, or turn and talk to your partner about what that word has meant in this
Mhm.
context. So they can really be more explicit in what they're wanting their students to potentially think about, and
Right.
then use that, as you're saying, to go
Yeah.
and form a paragraph. And yeah.
So it really is sort of a two-way relationship between oral language and written language. So you could have an oral discussion where students are. I witnessed this in a third grade classroom, for example. They were reading the book Charlotte's Web, and they had a discussion about what made Wilbur the pig different from the other animals on the farm where he's living. And so they talked about, well, he's the only pig, he's the only runt, but he's also the only animal who's been previously treated like a human baby. And then they did an activity called Because But So from the Writing
Mm-hmm.
Revolution. People maybe
Mm-hmm.
familiar with this. Wilbur
Mm-hmm.
is a different animal because but so. So they could draw on that oral discussion for their written answers. And then the teacher brought them back together to have another discussion based on what they had written. So the writing
Mm,
could then inform a discussion at a deeper level. Um,
mm,
and also, it's a great way to check for understanding before it's
yeah.
too late. So, one thing that happened in this classroom, even though these third graders had been working with these conjunctions for months, a lot of them had trouble using but. And so, one girl, for example, wrote, Wilbur is a different animal, but he's different from the other animals. And the teacher said, well, wait a minute. And this was happening with several kids. So, she was able to catch that misunderstanding before it was too late.
Mm. And it's so easily done. It's literally on the spot. She's not having
Mhm.
to wait, until the end of the week, where historically we might have collected in writing books and marked that writing.
Right.
And, they've kind of built those patterns of writing that way. So, um, Natalie, as we kind of wind up our time together, is there any sort of key messaging that you'd like to share with teachers here in New Zealand around if they were just starting out in their writing instruction? If they were just starting out, we have a lot of teachers who are incredibly knowledgeable in this space, and we have a lot of teachers who, I'm going to say, like myself, had come to a realization that actually there's a lot of stuff that I actually don't know about myself and I haven't been taught. Where would you recommend that those teachers start out in terms of building their own knowledge of teaching writing?
Well, obviously, I'd recommend the Writing Revolution book. It is designed to be a guide, a
Mm,
step-by-step guide, and you also need to know what your students need. But
mm,
I think starting with some of these sentence level activities, I mean, I know that some if teachers who have been quite skeptical of this the whole approach, if they once they've tried it, they've become enthusiastic converts. So
mm,
I think, and it's not necessarily as simple as it might sound. It does to embed these activities in the content you're teaching requires a bit of work. So there's a learning curve, but then teachers have told me it becomes part of their instruction. It becomes much easier once they've done it for a while and that they are seeing enormous changes in their students and that they would never go back. And I would just add that the book is a great place to start, but if you want to take it to the next level, the Writing Revolution organization does offer online training courses in
mm.
the method that I think there are some that are convenient for New Zealand and
Yes.
Australia in terms of timing. And I've sat in on those courses. They're quite good. So that's if you want to really take it to the next level, I'd highly recommend those.
Thank you. So obviously starting with the writing revolution is a really great move. I also want to pick up what you were talking about with the read alouds. I think New Zealand classrooms, read alouds are alive and well, but how we are utilising those read alouds to build background knowledge and do some of the things that we were talking about earlier, and sort of have that reciprocity between oral language and written language. I think that's an area that we could really, really be thinking about, really understanding how we can use read alouds. And then I actually wrote down a question too as you were talking, and I wonder if it's a question that we might all really lean into in our classrooms. I'm not currently a classroom teacher, but for the teachers that I work alongside, it's just to always be asking ourselves, no matter what subject we teach, what knowledge do my students really need to grasp in this particular unit of work? And I think if we continuously and maybe even have that question somewhere visible for us to see as educators, that we're continuously coming back to what knowledge do my students need, and then really sort of building our own awareness of how we are working to build that knowledge within our students. And then we could take it that step further and say, what opportunities for writing am I explicitly teaching and building? Um,
Mhm.
so that we're really leaning into understanding that reading and writing, or reading is a mechanism for writing, but there are so many other mechanisms, and that writing is ultimately about us portraying the knowledge we have about a particular subject area. And
Mhm.
hopefully some of our secondary teachers will lean into that, Natalie, and start to see the value. I know myself over the last 5 years in particular, I love to write. It is actually a downtime thing for me. I love to write, and I have. I know now that it has really been a tool or a mechanism to build my knowledge in the space of evidence-based literacy practices. Natalie,
Mhm.
thank you
Yeah.
so much for joining
Oh,
us in your
good.
afternoon from Washington, D.C. It's been a real privilege, and I know there are so many nuggets of gold in this chit chat for teachers across all year levels to pick up on. Um, but I'm going to hand over to you because I know you've got some really exciting news to
Oh,
share with us.
yes. Well, first of all, thank you for having me. This has been a great discussion. But also, the news is that I am coming to New Zealand in August for the Cultivating the Literacy Landscape conference in Auckland on August 20th and 21st. I'll be speaking there and never been to New Zealand before. Everyone tells me it's a gorgeous country, fascinating place. And so I am very much looking forward to both the conference and to visiting the country.
Yeah, thank you, Natalie. We're super excited to be hosting you, and really looking forward to having you in person and being able to have lots and lots of discussion, and really looking forward to the value that you'll add to our current literacy landscape here in New Zealand. So Thank you again. It's a few months down the track, but when the time rolls around, we wish you safe travels and look forward to seeing you here on New Zealand soils. Thank you so much for your time with us today.
Well, thank you, Carla. It was a pleasure.